My name is Richard Miles. I'm the director of the U.S.-Mexico Futures Initiative at the Center for Strategic International Studies. On behalf of CSIS, I'd like to welcome you to this morning's event on the NAFTA renegotiation and on strengthening North American competitiveness and prosperity. We're very pleased to have as our co-host for this event the George W. Bush Presidential Center. I'd like to recognize and thank Matthew Rooney, the Director of Economic Growth at the Bush Center. We have a number of distinguished visitors here today. I'd like to recognize one in particular, Ambassador Carla Hills, who's of course the lead negotiator for NAFTA 1.0. Let me set the stage for our discussion today by asking a very basic question. What happened to NAFTA? In 1993, it was passed in the House with 132 Republican and 102 Democratic votes. In the Senate, it sailed through with the support of 34 Republicans and 27 Democrats. In the next 3 presidential campaigns, it was mostly a non-issue. By 2008, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton both said it was a mistake, and candidate Obama called for it to be amended. President Trump continues to call it, quote, the worst trade deal in the history of the world. Sorry you had to hear that, Ambassador Hills. So how did we go from a strong bipartisan consensus on forging a close trade relationship with our nearest neighbors to one in which NAFTA is seen as bad for the United States and a political loser? Is the problem just with the agreement itself, or the core idea behind it, that is that economic integration in North America is a good thing? And even if NAFTA 2.0 turns out to be achievable, is NAFTA 3.0, that is a broader integration of markets and energy, manufacturing, agriculture, and labor, is that even possible? Our keynote speaker today, Senator Rob Portman, is one of the most experienced policymakers in Washington on the issue of trade. First elected to Congress in 1993, he represented Ohio's 2nd District for 12 years. He was named as U.S. Trade Representative in 2005 and later served as the Director of Office of Management and Budget during the George W. Bush administration. In 2010 and 2016, he was elected to the U.S. Senate. Senator Portman serves on the Foreign Relations Committee and the Homeland Security Committee, among others. Senator Portman will be followed by a panel of experts who I will bring to the stage after his remarks. So please join me in a warm welcome to Senator Portman.
Miles, thank you very much. It's great to be here this morning, particularly to be with Carla Hills, one of my predecessors as U.S. Trade Representative and one of the people that I always look to for advice and counsel. Miles, thank you for your good work, not just on NAFTA-related issues, but on U.S.-Mexican relations, U.S.-Canadian relations, and ensuring our North American free trade continues strong. This morning, I also want to, of course, express our condolences to those who lost their lives in the aftermath of the earthquake in Mexico. I think its loss of life is now approaching 100 people. And it's been a tough time between Harvey and Irma and the earthquake. And our thoughts, of course, go out to our neighbors in Florida and in the Caribbean at a time when that earthquake or that hurricane continues to blow and the storm surge continues to grow as we look at this beautiful day here in Washington. So we think about them. And I thank CSIS and also the George W. Bush Institute. I'm here because of George W. Bush, both specifically here this morning because I'm here to pay respect to him as my former boss, and also I wouldn't have been U.S. Trade Representative had he not asked me to take on that role. I got a call one day when I was in my office and I was helping to be able to provide counsel to the Bush administration on potential nominees to that post, and I went through about 5 names, probably 4 of whom are in the room here today, of people who would be great at the job. And Josh Bolton, who at that time was Chief of Staff, was very clever. He made me go through all 5, and then he told me why each had some issue, and then he said, so we'd like you to do it. And I said, no, I'm not interested. And I went home that weekend, and my wife said, they've asked you to do this. I was a member of the House of Representatives at the time, had a safe district, and was very happy. But she said, your president calls, and of course, you must do this. And I did, and I'm glad I did. It's not an easy job. It's a tough job, as Carla Hills will attest, but it's also a really important job, and maybe particularly now. So anyway, I know George W. Bush not only has a commitment to trade generally, but specifically on Mexico. He has a soft spot, meaning that he really has a passion about improving our relationship with our neighbors to the south. And so that's one reason it's important we're here today, because I think an honest dialogue on the North American Free Trade Agreement is an appropriate gathering. It seems like not a week goes by when there's not a headline about trade these days, and I think it's for a couple reasons. One, I do think there's a realization around the country that we need to expand our exports. It's not always couched that way. A lot of times it's couched in different ways, saying we need to bring back the manufacturing jobs that have been lost. And certainly in my home state of Ohio, there's a passionate cry for that. But that's really in part about exports, because when you bring back those manufacturing jobs, you are creating new export market overseas. I'll give you an example. When the Ford Motor Company recently decided to bring jobs back to Ohio from Mexico, many of those trucks are now being exported to Mexico from Ohio. And that's something the Trump administration is really focused on, is how to bring back manufacturing jobs and, in effect, bring back more exports. We do not export in this country to the extent other countries do. It's one of our great potential opportunities to give the economy a shot in the arm, including now. Our exports per capita, I think somewhere between Tonga and Ethiopia, about 200 down in the list of countries. Other countries are just much more dependent on export markets than we are. So this has always been something that, from Carla Hill's time to my time to today, that U.S. trade representatives are promoting, is how to meet that potential and take advantage of the opportunity to export more. So we're hearing a lot about that. And then second, we're hearing a lot about unfair trade. I think there are about a half dozen big unfair trade cases either already launched or being investigated, including with regard to China on intellectual property, something that I worked a lot on when I was at USTR through the investigation we did under the TRIPS agreement, and then later a couple cases were actually filed with the WTO with regard to noncompliance on the laws in effect with regard to intellectual property protection. But there are other cases too, and a lot we've heard about. The steel cases we won last summer were something that got headlines certainly in my home state of Ohio. So trade is out there as a political issue today, as Miles has suggested, maybe more than in the recent past. I will say I disagree a little with Miles's implication that somehow the NAFTA Accord was always uncontroversial and a great bipartisan effort. It was hard. And again, I think Carla can attest to this. In 1994, the agreement did not sail through. In fact, it was very difficult on both sides of the aisle. President Clinton, later President Bush, and others had to work very hard to get members of their own party to support it. And yet it was bipartisan, that's true, and that's changed with regard to trade agreements. The level of bipartisanship has decreased consistently since then. But it wasn't easy. It was very hard. And it continues to be hard, and there's some good reasons for that. Again, my home state of Ohio being a manufacturing state that's lost jobs, there are a lot of concerns, and some significant concerns. I think we've got to get back to the basics, and to me it's, again, pretty simple. It's expanding exports. Both of these, by the way, to me are about leveling the playing field. We hear that term a lot. Expanding exports is really about knocking down barriers to our products to try to level that playing field. We're a relatively open country. Our average tariff, I think, is about 4.5%. Our non-tariff barriers are less than most of our trading partners, significantly less than some of them, as you know. And so it's about leveling the playing field on the export side. And then, of course, it's about leveling the playing field on the inbound side, being sure that when imports are sold in this country, they're sold fairly. And a number of these trade cases I talked about are about anti-dumping or selling it below the cost. It's about subsidizing countervailing duties that are put in place because other countries are subsidizing exports almost as a loss leader to the United States market. So that should be our focus, is one, expanding exports, two, being sure that imports are fairly traded. And doing that, we benefit everyone. the level of the playing field is actually in legislation now. Legislation passed last year called Level the Playing Field Act. We came up with a very creative name, and I was the co-author of that legislation, and it's resulted in winning some cases that otherwise would have been difficult to win, at least in a timely way, before a company in the United States finds it has to start laying off workers or even go through bankruptcy. To give them the ability to have a decision more quickly, to me, has always been incredibly important. I'm a recovering trade lawyer myself, having most represented U.S. companies, and frustration often in the U.S., as you know, particularly among smaller companies that can't afford the professional help, is that it just takes so long to win a case, and when you win it, sometimes the remedy is not very effective. So we're trying to improve that with the Level the Playing Field Act. In this context of the pushing for more exports and ensuring that our imports are fairly traded, I want to talk about trade agreements. I think we're missing the boat when we see our FTAs and our agreements with 20 countries now around the world as the problem. And I say this with facts behind me, which is that, and this is a surprise to a lot of people, those 20 countries, of whom we have about, I don't know, a dozen, 13 trade agreements, those 20 countries and the United States actually have a slight trade surplus. So the notion that with a $500 billion trade deficit, which roughly are numbers from last year, that somehow our problem is with regard to the trade agreements, and just misses the boat if you're going to focus on deficits, and that in the aggregate, we have a slight surplus with these countries. Second, and maybe most importantly, all these countries together represent about 10% of global GDP. You think about it, we don't have a trade agreement with China or Japan or Europe. But the countries with whom we have trade agreements, like Canada and Mexico, comprise about 10% of global GDP. And yet we send 47% of our exports to that 10% of the world. 47% of our exports, nearly half, go to only 10% of the world. So do trade agreements work to knock down the barriers to exports I talked about earlier? Well, yes, they do. And it goes beyond that. It goes to the kind of rules we can put in place, the kind of market reforms that have happened in these countries. But the important thing, I think, to remember here is that when people are pointing to trade agreements as the problem, and they're pointing to deficits as the issue, that finger pointing is misplaced as it goes to trade agreements. By the way, from Ohio, we send 60% of our exports to 10% of the world. And with regard to Mexico and Canada, together comprising about, I don't know, Mexico's about 1% of global GDP, Canada's maybe closer to 2%. So we send 50% of our exports to about 3% of the world from Ohio. And that's because we're heavily dependent on exports, including of manufacturing products, to those two countries. 1 out of every 3 acres planted in Ohio, from an ag perspective, is exported. And those two markets are incredibly important for our agriculture exports as well. And in Ohio, we're about 7th in the country in agriculture, so it means a lot to us. What does this mean? Again, more exports means more jobs. 25% of factory workers in Ohio have their jobs because of exports. So we have to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, as they say, because these jobs are really important. We want them. And by the way, the jobs in these export-intensive industries pay more. So export jobs pay, as you know, on average over 15% more than other jobs. They have better benefits. So with regard to the healthcare debate ongoing and the skyrocketing costs of healthcare, having good benefits, having a job that pays better is really important right now with the middle class squeeze that we're facing in my home state and others where expenses are up and wages are flat. Again, a need for us to ensure we continue to have the exports that we currently have and to expand those exports. So that's the context for me. Let's fight for a level playing field, of course. And that goes on both sides. And we need to be tougher on our trade enforcement, in my view. But also let's be sure that we are properly viewing where the problem lies and not perhaps inadvertently hurting workers in my home state and other states who are benefiting from this expansion of exports. As important as it is for Ohio, I've also been out there supporting updating NAFTA. Why? Well, it's 23 years old, and in the subsequent trade agreements, we've made a lot of changes. And you think about it, 23 years ago, if you had asked me or Ambassador Hills or others of us who were involved at that time in some of these issues about e-commerce, we probably would have looked at you like you were crazy. You know, there was no e-commerce title in NAFTA because there was virtually no e-commerce. And so, of course, you need to update it for e-commerce. And we can and should. And, you know, by the way, as we do that, we have to be sure we do it properly. I think it's important that in trade agreements we export our ideas as well as our goods and services. We believe in free markets. You know, we believe that people can be better off by having more transparency and less corruption. That's part of what we do with trade agreements. That's a very important part of it. But particularly on e-commerce, I've been very focused on the relationship between Mexico and the United States and Canada and the United States as it relates to what's called the Communications Decency Act, and particularly Section 230. Now, this is a special interest of mine, but it's an example, I think, of where we have to be careful. While we want to export our ideas that make sense, we don't want to export laws that don't make sense. And with regard to Section 230, here in this country, under our laws, we are permitting sex traffickers to work online with immunity. I think it's inadvertent. I don't think it was intended that way. Again, this law goes back to the 1990s as well. But there's been some discussion of promoting that legislation with regard to our NAFTA renegotiation. And so we're watching that very carefully. We want to be sure that we are exporting our good ideas, but not, again, perhaps inadvertently exporting our bad ideas. The explosion of trafficking online is the reason we see an increase in trafficking in this country, and we have to be sure to have a narrow but an effective way to remove that immunity to allow prosecutors to go after these folks online who are selling women, selling girls, selling boys. So that's an example of where I think we need to be careful. Again, not a trade discussion in particular, but it's amazing how many things end up being part of a trade agreement. Digital trade, we talked about. There are also other opportunities with regard to renegotiating the NAFTA Accord that are important to Ohio and to all of our states. And so rules of origin, you know, is something that's going to be discussed quite a bit. There are other aspects of trade that have changed a lot since the NAFTA Accord and the subsequent agreements. Of course, we focused a lot on environmental and labor provisions, not in NAFTA, and so there's an opportunity to update in that regard. And frankly, my discussions with Bob Lighthizer, who's the current U.S. Trade Representative, it has never been about withdrawing from NAFTA. It's always been about improving NAFTA. And by necessity, that means improving it for all three parties, because that's what a negotiation is about. And that example I use of labor and environmental standards, just to give you one example, is one where I think there's, frankly, a lot of agreement, as I understand it. And so there's some opportunities here to do some things that can improve the agreement. One that I think is important is that we put into the new NAFTA Accord, the updated NAFTA Accord, some provisions that might not apply to Mexico and Canada as much as it applies to other countries. But this is an opportunity for us to have a template that works for other countries. And I would put in that category currency manipulation. I don't believe that Canada or Mexico is manipulating their currency. I don't think that's an issue between us. But I do think, based on the congressional authorization of a couple of years ago, that it's an opportunity for us to put in place some provisions that make sense as a template to use with other countries, particularly trading partners in Asia, with whom we would like to have more agreements. There's discussion, as you know, of a U.S.-Japan trade agreement as an example. So these are opportunities for us to use the NAFTA Accord as a way to ensure accountability for our foreign trading partners in future agreements. Not all these issues, again, directly affect North American trade, but establishing policies and bolstering enforcement abilities in NAFTA will send a message to our partners around the world. The result of a successfully renegotiated agreement, in my view, is simply a strengthened North American market. And here in the United States, we can see a stronger economy that grows from that. As I said, our opportunity to export can be enhanced even further. We've got an incredibly efficient workforce in this country now. I look at manufacturing in Ohio as an example, and it has changed dramatically since the days of 1994 debate over the North American Free Trade Agreement. We're competitive. We have some of the best trained workers, some of the best technology in the world. Of course, in Ohio, we have the best workers in the world, and we really do. It's amazing to see what they're doing, and we just have to be sure we give them that level playing field I talked about earlier to be able to compete. If so, they'll do fine. They'll compete and they'll win, and trade, which is about goods and services going across borders to enhance everybody's ability to have more opportunities, to improve the quality of life and the standard of living is something that we have to continue to focus on as a country. So I'm more optimistic maybe than some folks here in the room with regard to what can happen in this accord. I think it's an opportunity to update. It's an opportunity to reestablish that strong relationship that goes well beyond trade between two of our most important allies in the world right here in our neighborhood. Thanks very much for having me today, Miles, and I look forward to staying in touch with all of you going forward. I told Miles I have 2 hearings going on right now, and I apologize I can't stay for the panel, but this is a crazy time on the Hill, to say the least.
Thank you very much, Senator Portman, for joining us this morning. At this point, I would like to call to the stage our panel, led by Scott Miller here at CSIS, and Scott will make an individual introduction for each one of the panelists.
Well, terrific, and let me add my welcome to all of you here at CSIS, and the welcome to our online audience. We're delighted if you've either come over here or tuned in, we're delighted you're here, and we hope to have an entertaining discussion that follows up on the wise counsel of Senator Portman. I want to add my personal thanks to Senator Portman. When he and I both had a lot less gray hair, we were neighbors in a little town called Terrace Park, Ohio, and he was my congressman. And over the years, I've seldom met an elected official with greater depth of thoughtfulness on the issue and more comprehensive view of sort of life in American politics. He's always been a great source of advice and a tremendous leader in his own quiet way. So we're greatly appreciative of the Senator for joining us this morning. Today's moderated panel is a particularly interesting one in the Washington think tank world because we have a very rare incident that happened before your eyes. No speaker on this panel is from inside the Beltway. In fact, there's nobody here from the Acela corridor except yours truly. And so, and I'm just going to try to keep a conversation going. So we're delighted to have a panel. And I make that point because our event partner, the George W. Bush Institute, has led a very comprehensive multi-stakeholder effort to develop an action plan to improve North American competitiveness. If you know President George W. Bush from the days of his governorship in Texas and perhaps before, he had a strong commitment to good relations with Mexico and to improving the commercial integration between the U.S. and Mexico. He did a lot as governor. This was a constant interest of his as president. He focused on it, and in his post-presidency, he's focused again, which is quite useful. And I'm particularly pleased to welcome this group because they've been part of this multi-stakeholder process that talked to people who weren't inside the Beltway, that talked to people who are actual practitioners. And I think it makes a difference in the content and quality of both the recommendations that came out of the process, but what was learned and the thinking in the process. So we're delighted to have today Matthew Rooney. Matt is the Director of Economic Growth at the George W. Bush Institute and has been the leader of this process. So I'll let him describe first, what they've gone through, how they've arrived at the recommendations, and what the next steps might be. But we also have interlocutors from Canada and Mexico with us today. Andrea van Vugt is the Vice President for North America of the Canadian Council, Business Council of Canada, excuse me. Both have problems now as an old guy with close reading, and when I get a Canadian card, I've got to make sure I'm reading the English, not the French, so my apologies. The Business Council of Canada. And Sergio Gómez, who is the Chief Executive Officer of ICOM Strategic Advisors, LLC, based in Mexico. So, Matt, tell us what's going on.
Thank you very much, Scott. Good morning, everyone. Ambassador Hills, it's a pleasure to be here with you. Richard, thank you very much for your partnership. Thank you all, our friends at CSIS, for your partnership in bringing this morning's event together. It's a great pleasure to work with the CSIS group, and to be here with you all today. Thank you for being here. I want to talk a little bit about the process that we've gone through at the George W. Bush Institute in Dallas over the last couple of years. And basically what I want to do today is argue that NAFTA is much more than a trade agreement that simply eliminated tariffs and other barriers to trade between the three North American neighbors, that it's actually a competitiveness strategy, or it's the cornerstone of a competitiveness strategy for the United States in the 21st century. And even more, I think it's not too much of a stretch to say that NAFTA is the cornerstone of a template, really, for the global economy that the United States proposed in those days and has used to continue to shape the rules for the global economy in the intervening years. Just briefly, the George W. Bush Institute, perhaps not terribly familiar to this group. We are from well outside the Beltway. We're located in Dallas, Texas, on the campus of Southern Methodist University. We are a think and do tank, founded by President and Mrs. Bush when they left the White House in 2009, with an agenda that's designed to promote a number of ideas and issues that they felt particularly strongly about in public life, including education reform, military service, and global health and women's empowerment. We have a series of leadership programs directed at all those areas. And my piece of it is styled economic growth. The economic growth agenda arises from a series of conferences and a book that the Institute published in 2011 called The 4% Solution, which was an agenda for how we could return the United States to a sustained economic growth of 4%. And in looking at that very broad agenda, which had numerous elements, including labor market reform and tax reform and education reform, regulation reform, all the way over to globalization, trade, investment, and immigration. We looked for what we call white space, places where think tank world was not deeply engaged, where we thought we could make a unique contribution, and focus therefore our efforts in particular on immigration and on globalization. And in the globalization space, arising from a dinner that President Bush hosted in Dallas in 2014, where he brought together, this is before I was involved, he brought together a group of leaders, thought leaders, political leaders from across the North American space, Mexico, Canada, the United States, for a focused conversation on North America and on NAFTA. And already in 2014, President Bush had perceived that there was a rising sense of anxiety about globalization, about the openness of the American economy that had focused fairly or unfairly on the NAFTA process. And so the group that came together in Dallas in 2014 agreed with that proposition and encouraged the Bush Institute to take that on as an agenda. And therefore, the president asked the Institute to carry out a study program on the North American economic integration process and to put forward ideas for how it could be strengthened and improved. So beginning in 2015, we launched a series of initiatives. We have on our website what we hope is a very helpful set of kind of data tools. The intellectual progenitors of that process are with us here this morning. Chris, nice to see you. Thanks for being here. You'll find it bushcenter.org/North America. We have our competitiveness scorecard. With our competitiveness scorecard, what we did is we brought together indices of competitiveness from other sources, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, the Heritage Foundation, the Fraser Institute in Canada, amalgamated those into a single database and created an interactive tool that the user can use to look at North American competitiveness, the competitiveness of the North American group benchmarked against other trading groups and against other trading nations. Spoiler alert, North America is the most competitive among the major trading groups. We compete actually as a group in the space of the major trading nations on the earth. It is difficult to look at that database and conclude that NAFTA integration has somehow harmed the ability of the United States or our neighbors to compete in the global economy. The other data tool we have there is our economic integration web tool that you can also look at. We wanted to explore a little bit the impacts of the integration process on that competitiveness agenda. Why is it that we have sustained our competitiveness even as we have integrated with the relatively less developed country of Mexico, and even as we have integrated across the North American space. The thing that's interesting there that emerges very clearly from that presentation is even as trade and investment relationships among the North American partners have increased, even as Mexico and Canada have traded more with the rest of the world, they've traded still more with the United States, and the United States global trade has expanded by much more than intra-NAFTA trade. And the takeaway for me from that is that, as is often asserted, but you can see it on our web presentation, the United States gains significantly from the integration process in terms of our ability to compete in the rest of the world. So we think those are interesting data points that I hope have the occasional talking point and the occasional factoid that this audience can use, that your bosses can use in discussing this issue. Taking a step further, we then convened, as Scott alluded to, a multi-stakeholder working group that brought together thought leaders from across Mexico, Canada, and the United States, from business, from government, from academia, for a series of discussions. We took it on the road. We went to San Diego. We took our group across the border to Tijuana. We looked at the energy integration that's taking place there. We went to Detroit and Windsor. We crossed the border. We looked at very interesting phenomenon that is taking place there in educational institutions that work across the border. Everybody's heard of the Detroit-Windsor nursing phenomenon, the number of nurses that commute across the border every day to work in Detroit, living in Canada. And we, based on that discussion, we developed a series of recommendations, which we presented to the public just in November of last year. President Bush presented those at an event in Dallas. And our recommendations, our objective with our recommendations was to provide proposals for ways of upgrading the relationship among Mexico, Canada, and the United States. We didn't actually at that time think in terms of actually amending NAFTA, but how could you provide upgrades to the relationship in ways that would make the whole group still more competitive? Our focus, the focus that emerged from our working group was on two main things: border infrastructure. Anybody who's worked on border infrastructure issues, anybody who's crossed one of our borders, knows that the border infrastructure process in North America is broken, largely because of the way the United States handles appropriation and funding and financing for border infrastructure, and because of the way the United States handles the permitting process for border infrastructure. So we made a series of proposals there built around, we think there would be great benefit from the creation of a border infrastructure bank that you could build, for example, on the foundation of the NAD Bank that already exists as a U.S.-Mexico institution. You could expand it to Canada. You could use it as a way of setting priorities and funneling resources and partnering with the private sector by bringing in private capital, by ensuring that the board is expanded to include private interests, and make border infrastructure and border infrastructure planning simply more responsive to the market. Under the current circumstances, it's almost entirely political. Border crossings are built in places that may or may not have anything to do with what with what the companies and businesses that trade across those borders actually want. The other main thing we focused on was human resources development, workforce development, where I think across the North American space, one of the things that emerged very clearly from our working group is there are numerous job and wage gaps across the North American space, skills gaps in different places. Jobs are emerging in places where people are not. Jobs are emerging in sectors where people are not trained. That's true across the North American space. We think a coordinated private sector-led process to create a kind of unified North American approach to workforce development would be extremely beneficial, would start to build down a long-term divergence, particularly in Mexico, I think, but also in the United States, between wages and productivity, which is distorting investment decisions and I think driving a lot of the anxiety that we're experiencing in the United States. We then further convened our working group, specifically focused on the emerging prospect of a NAFTA renegotiation. We met in the spring, and we issued a new series of recommendations focused really on encouraging the governments to think in terms of competitiveness and regional competitiveness in the process of reviewing the NAFTA structure. NAFTA is a trade agreement. It has created an interesting phenomenon that everybody talks about of supply chains, and reviewing NAFTA with an eye to how it could be a still more effective platform for competitiveness, I think would be an interesting and useful rethinking. In general, I think as we go about this, we have to be realistic. The global economy is not going to spontaneously arrange itself to foster the productivity and prosperity of the United States. That's going to take leadership. That's going to take American leadership. We should not shy away from that. And then I think NAFTA, as the first major kind of post-Cold War trade agreement that engaged both developing and developed countries, was a paradigm for the way the United States envisions a global economy. Elimination of tariffs, elimination of non-tariff barriers, non-discrimination, intellectual property rights protections. This is not the menu that some of the alternative pretenders to global leadership on trade would necessarily choose. We also have never engaged in shared sovereignty. We don't engage in free movement of people as a trade component. Other trade approaches around the world would do that. So as we go through this process, I think there are ways we could very pragmatically and very relatively simply, actually, upgrade our ability to compete in the world in partnership with our Mexican and Canadian neighbors. We can exercise leadership in the global economy based on the NAFTA Foundation. And I think we should, as Americans, be very careful to keep in mind that there's something seriously wrong when you don't feel like you can win at a game where you wrote the rules. Mm-hmm. We have an opportunity to write the rules again. I hope we seize it. Thank you, Scott.
Thanks. Andrea.
Thanks very much, Scott. I appreciate the invitation of CSIS to be here, and especially the Bush Institute's leadership on North America. I think that the Business Council of Canada has benefited from a number of years of participation in the Bush Institute's work on North America, and it's an organization only like the Bush Institute that I think was able to convene the group of experts from Canada, the United States, and Mexico that it did in order to be able to contribute to the work that the Bush Institute's put out on a North American agenda for competitiveness. There's no surprise that many of the recommendations that came out of the Bush Institute's paper are recommendations that you would find in the Business Council's letter to Prime Minister Trudeau with respect to our agenda for the NAFTA negotiations, or our letter to Secretary Ross with respect to Canada's agenda for the NAFTA negotiations, and it's because they're smart. They're smart, and it's a funny thing about these negotiations. They're different. They're different from any other negotiation I've participated in. I've been in a number of them now. These negotiations have a large group of people saying, let's do better, let's go farther, let's make improvements, let's modernize. And then you have a significant group of people who are saying, NAFTA's been a problem. And it's been a problem for our local communities. And we've lost jobs, and we've suffered, and we've lost industry, we've lost important contributions to our local economies. And while I don't believe that that story is true, I believe that that's the story that's been allowed to fester among local communities across the United States. And so now we're into a negotiation, which is different from most, because typically in a negotiation, you would expand liberalization. You would expand the opportunities that you share with your trading partners. And this one's a little bit different, because it's not particularly clear that at the end of the day, that you will not have seen a little bit of a retrenchment from the free trade that you see today. And it's frankly incumbent upon us, upon our organizations and our companies, my member companies back in Canada, and all of us here, to do everything that we can to make sure that that doesn't happen. Because if that happens, then the competitiveness of our region, the competitiveness of Canada, of Mexico, of the United States, suffers. And the direct implication of that is an advantage to a key competitor of the United States, who one could argue is actually the biggest part of the problem. If you threaten the competitiveness of North America, you increase the competitiveness, the competitive argument of other countries, particularly in Asia. And that's a problem, and that's a serious threat. And we have to do everything that we possibly can to make sure that that doesn't happen. While we put forward an agenda that's positive and progressive with respect to the NAFTA negotiations that has many of the Bush Institute's recommendations, Canada is also exposed. This is a difficult conversation for us, and it's because Ambassador Hills did such good work in liberalizing trade in NAFTA 1.0. We already enjoy extensive liberal trade between Canada and the United States and Canada and Mexico. And so the problem is that many of the things that are left are difficult. And there's in some of the most difficult areas for Canada. And so when Canada looks at the things that we want from the United States, those are also difficult things. And so the challenge at the end of the day is going to be for all of our countries to be able to say, we gave, but we got, and there's balance. And at the end of the day, our businesses, our workers, our farmers will enjoy better access and a more competitive environment so that we can compete abroad. Our organizations are doing everything that we can to deliver on that, and it's important for us to collaborate together. But I want to leave you with 2 points, because frankly, Senator Portman said much of what I wanted to say anyways. I got involved in politics 25 years ago because of NAFTA, which is actually strange to me and suggests that I was not a particularly interesting child. At home somewhere in boxes, I have my I'm a free trader pin that I wore in elementary school. I was not a popular kid. But that's what got me involved in politics. It's strange to me today that more than 25 years later, I'm now representing 160 Canadian CEOs defending NAFTA. And I worry that if we don't do something different, that my kids, if they have the same fascination with trade that I do, will also be defending NAFTA 20 years from now. NAFTA, at the end of the day, all trade, it's true, is about people. And so there's 2 things I just want to mention. One is trade adjustment assistance. It is not for a Canadian to suggest to the United States what to do, how to help your workers, how to help retrain, how to help build up the communities that have suffered. It's not really for me to suggest it, but I can't emphasize enough that someone needs to wrap their arms around this. Because at the end of the day, unless people at the ground believe as though the government is responding to their concerns at the local level, then trade agreements are going to be challenged in the United States forever. And so I'm happy to contribute in any way that I possibly can to that, but I worry about the future of trade if we don't do what we can to address that issue. The other thing that I want to leave you with is, at the end of the day, I think a lot of this is going to come down to Congress. And our members of Congress are hearing from people at their local level that trade has hurt them. And while I know that statistics are not as empowering as stories, it's important that we also give our members of Congress and our senators and our governors the positive stories about trade. So in probably a week, the Business Council is going to launch a program where we provide all of the trade and investment data between Canada and the United States at the congressional district level. And we're making it public, we're making it available to everyone, and we're doing that so that people, businesses, and particularly our members, but we're making it available to everyone so that everyone can use it, can go in and talk to their member of Congress about why they are in their congressional district, about the people that they employ, about the things they buy, the things they sell, and the importance of NAFTA at the very local level. And that they bring their stories about their presence in the congressional districts to their members of Congress. Because at the end of the day, no matter what happens with NAFTA, it's going to be up to Congress as to whether or not it succeeds. So, if there's a message that I can leave you with, it's we need to modernize, we need to do better, we need to go farther, we need to make sure that we keep our region more competitive. We also need to figure out how to wrap our arms around this problem that Americans feel as though trade has left them behind. And we need to get out to our members of Congress and give them the positive messages of trade and of NAFTA. And I recognize that that is just a small thing, that that's easily accomplished, that that's probably not much work to do, but it's imperative if we want to see trade successful in the United States and in our region broadly.
Thank you, Andrea. Sergio.
Well, thank you very much for Bush Center and the CSIS for the opportunity to be here. Andrea, it's a pleasure to share this panel with you. Well, first of all, I would like to acknowledge the work that the center, the Bush Center, has done on NAFTA. I mean, if you care about NAFTA, you should take a look to those 5 recommendations that the center did, very succinct, substantive. Really, you went into the core issue of the negotiations. If negotiators would follow half of those recommendations, I think we are on the very right path. So congratulations for the work you've done. So, well, today, since Scott and Matt won't let me bring my PowerPoint, I brought my notes so I ensure that I don't go out of my own script. But I would like to talk to you about 2 issues from a Mexican perspective. First, where we are in North America and what should we do about NAFTA. On the first one, North America is most probably the most competitive region in the world, and to some extent, this is due to its complementarities. The rhetoric that we have been hearing the last months on the NAFTA has concentrated in the trade balance between its members. And I think we are missing a very important point, and that is the complementarities between the 3 members of the region. I mean, it is due to Mexican competitive costs, for example, that North American manufacturers can deal with the European and Asian competitors. And the name of the game today is competitiveness in a global market. And I think we should look at North America and its members as a region that is facing very fierce and strong competition in a global market. What I'm trying to say is that even if we hear and we follow this rhetoric, Mexico is not probably part of the problem, but more part of the solution of how we make this North American region more competitive. And we are in Mexico, as in Canada, we pay a lot of attention of what you say in Washington and what you discuss here in Washington, D.C. And in the past days, we've heard a lot of discussion on geopolitics when this issue of withdrawing the chorus came out. And it surprised me that when we discuss Mexico, we don't have that geopolitic discussion. And I think that's another mistake. I mean, Mexico is always a very cooperative partner to the U.S. in a wide range of strategic issues for the United States. This goes, I'm not talking now about trade, but I'm talking about the battle against terror, narcotics, immigration, environment, energy. So this very wide range of issues that are very strategic and key for the United States, where they have had for a long time a very cooperative and reliable partner, which is Mexico. They have if we talk about trade, they have also had a neighbor that is very committed to free trade. And in a neighborhood, talking about the continent, that is not necessarily committed to free trade. And I think there Mexico has played also a very important role. As soon as we finished the NAFTA negotiations 25 years ago, Mexico engaged in a series of free trade negotiations with Latin American countries. And well, guess what? The template we used for those negotiations was the NAFTA. So for our own Mexican reasons and for our own Mexican strategy, what we did is we went down in Latin America, spreading the gospel and putting the NAFTA into the laws of all the countries in the region willing to go and look seriously at free trade. Obviously, those agreements, several years later, were a very useful prerequisite to jump into agreements with the US. So we should, if we understand CAFTA, or if we understand the agreements that the US has with Latin American countries, we should understand what happened in NAFTA and what Mexico did with NAFTA a few years after those negotiations ended. So we shouldn't forget that this is a very cooperative and very reliable and very effective partnership, the one we have in North America. What is NAFTA for Mexico? NAFTA for Mexico is not only the elimination of tariffs. By the way, if we get rid of NAFTA, we will have a very uncomfortable scenario in tariffs within the region, but the tougher medicine will go on the US side because Mexico is very open with his 45, 46, I don't remember how many countries we have free trade agreement now with, but that's not the case for the countries we don't have free trade agreements. But again, NAFTA is much more than tariffs for Mexico. So NAFTA is, probably this is not politically correct, but I'm not in government, so NAFTA is a straitjacket for Mexico to keep in the market economy path. And that's a great value to, and Carla knows this very well because she was there in the negotiations and she looked at a Mexico that is completely different from the Mexico we have today. But we have to think about NAFTA, not only on those MFN tariffs that we'll have to pay, but also on the discipline, the rule, the market rule economy that has created and that has made Mexico such a reliable partner. So after saying all this, what should we do about NAFTA from a Mexican perspective? Well, first of all, we need to keep NAFTA alive and kicking. I mean, on the private sector, and we are very engaged with the Mexican Private Sector Coalition for the NAFTA negotiations, and we feel very strongly that we have to, at the end of this process, have a much more robust and stronger NAFTA to enhance economic integration. The NAFTA 2.0 should ensure that we have the state-of-the-art rules and procedures for moving goods and services. The seamless our borders are in terms of trade, the more competitive we are. So that's something key, and we can take advantage of that because 25 years ago, technologies were not there, and the world has changed a lot. So that's something we should, and I think negotiators are taking care of that. We can do this. There's a lot of talk about enforcement and not letting other regions benefiting illegally from the agreement, and we can do that. We can do that with technology. We can do that with intelligence gathering without hammering the current trade flows. Of course, NAFTA should also advance e-commerce, should promote regulatory cooperation. We should do all those, we should look very carefully at temporary entry. I mean, I'm sure all those oil and gas companies that are now participating in the Mexican energy reform will have a need of very technical expertise in Houston and in other areas of the US, moving back and forward to Mexico and implementing and going those very amazing drilling projects that are going on. So we should really try to deepen all those rules. We should also very carefully look at dispute settlement. Chapter 11, Chapter 19, and Chapter 20. These three different mechanisms that the agreement has all are very useful to the integration and to the competitiveness of the economy. So a new NAFTA should have all those three dispute settlement chapters, very strong and strengthened chapters, in my view. What NAFTA should not have? There has been a lot of talk about the rules of origin, about how this trade balance, about how this trade deficit should land into rules of origin with stricter regional content. And this is very tricky. It is very easy to oversimplify what a rule of origin can do. And it's very easy to think, okay, let's get stricter criteria. Let's put more regional content into the rules so we can have more North American goods into our internal trade. This is very tricky because if you tighten a rule of origin too much, you are risking to making companies or avoiding companies comply with the rule. And then this backfires very fast because today you have X regional content, 62.5% for autos. But if you put to the auto industry a rule of origin too strict, then that they cannot comply with, then they don't have any more the incentive to use that 62.5%. They will pay a duty at the borders, and then they can use input from all over the world. So this is very tricky, and I will end my comment saying that whatever we do with NAFTA, we shouldn't at any cost hinder the regional value chains that we have created these 23 years. So whatever we come out with, we should be very careful that the regional value chains that we created, that are the central pillar of our competitiveness, are there to be stronger and not weaker. And on the private sector side, we are looking at this with a very pragmatic approach, and we are very enthusiastic to get a new agreement reinforced and strengthened, but we are also very conscious of the risk we are facing. So this is a very complex and ambitious task we're facing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thanks to all the panelists for your comments. We were initially encouraged about the work that had been done by the Bush Institute, which what led to the invitation, led to this conference. But what I realized today, just listening to Andrea and Sergio, is our allies and friends are playing a long game. And that's a good thing. That's in our interest. And maybe we should start playing a long game too. So with that one comment, let me open to questions. Just three quick items, how we'll do the Q&A. First, once I recognize you, please wait for the microphone in respect to our online audience. And so anybody who follows up and watches this later will actually hear your question. When you do get the microphone, let us know your name and the organization with which you are affiliated. And please make sure your question, as Alex Trebek would say, is in the form of a question. With that. Yes, ma'am.
It has been, my name is Louise, and it has been touched upon before.
Your affiliation, your organization?
Embassy of Belgium.
Thank you.
So I was wondering, I had a question with regards to dispute settlement, rather ISDS, but also labor and environment. The US is quite unclear about its position on ISDS. The other countries are clear, but it also says with regards to labor and environment that it will have the same standards for dispute settlement in those issues and for ISDS. So my first question is, what does this mean? And my second question is also, how do you see this ideally? Because, well, one of the big problems is that one of your main concerns is that your workers lose their jobs by moving around. And, well, accurate enforcement of laws would help in this regard. So do you see an international independent tribunal as a solution there? Would you recommend that, or do you think it should be in the power of the countries itself?
Let me take a shot at that. It's a great question. First, with regard to the structure of U.S. Free trade agreements or preferential trade agreements, what the Congress has indicated, and ultimately, as you know, Congress retains the power to regulate foreign commerce and provides fairly clear instructions in the form of negotiating objectives in places like the the Trade Priorities Act of 2015. And in that, in terms of labor and environment, the U.S. Negotiating objective and what has materialized in previous agreements, more recent than NAFTA, is that the labor and environment provisions are incorporated in the treaty itself. They're part of the agreement rather than a side agreement, number one. Number two, they are subject to the same dispute settlement as commercial matters in the treaty, but that is a process of state-to-state dispute settlement, which is how other commercial disputes in any free trade agreement are settled. And since the NAFTA, or since the U.S. goal in negotiating labor and environment chapters are to hold governments to specific standards of general applicability across the traded sectors, it's worked reasonably well. Nobody who ever enters into dispute settlement as an aggrieved party ever is happy with it, because it's very time consuming and reasonably expensive. That's true in commercial arbitration. It's true in Article III court litigation. It's true in international dispute settlement, and whether that's the WTO or in a bilateral or trilateral agreement. So that addresses labor and environment in terms of what the Congress has indicated. With regard to investment disputes, the Congress has also been quite clear that there ought to be a protection of U.S. investors abroad. The standards of protection ought to be equivalent to U.S. law and practice. And there ought to be an alternative in place where courts are inadequate. And that has always been the treaty-based arbitration system at ICSID, or what we call investor-state dispute settlement. Congress actually spent more energy on the substance than on the process. The substance of the substantive obligations in the investment chapter, and not the mechanism for dispute settlement, which is what seems to attract all the energy and the intensity. So Congress is pretty clear about the substantive obligations. It is easy to find in the 2008 and 2004 and 2012 model bilateral investment treaties. So what's happened since NAFTA? In NAFTA, our investment treaties were actually a lot simpler. You go to one negotiated in the Reagan administration, the U.S.-Egypt bilateral investment treaty. It's about 8 pages long. Okay, move that ahead past those new model bilateral investment treaties, and there are about 40 pages of text. Now, how do you get from 8 to 40? Well, one of the ways you get from 8 to 40 in the terms of the substantive obligations is Congress insisted that when the executive negotiate these agreements, that there be a rough equivalence with treatment in U.S. courts under U.S. law. And so there's a lot of clarification, amplification, for instance, in terms of what constitutes a taking. There's actually a 4-part test from the famous Penn Central case, Supreme Court case, that is now part of our BITs. And so you look carefully, that's basically what the Congress did. Now there still is an instruction in these obligations by the Congress to provide for a dispute resolution that is as depoliticized as possible and independent of the judiciary, so long as foreign investors do not have greater substantive rights. So that is where the Congress is. You're correct that it's unclear where the Trump administration is at this point. The negotiating objectives were very terse in this section that's presented to the Congress. There were some suggestions of other mechanisms involved, like an opt-out mechanism. There was also some pretty serious pushback by the business community, which basically said, if you drop Chapter 11 and investor state, we're out of here. so there's an auto so it hasn't unfolded completely yet. But so answers to labor and environment are separate than investment, which is separate than other forms of dispute resolution. So I hope we can clear about that.
Could I just make an observation on that? I personally think that the debate over ISDS is kind of surprising, really, and that it should have arisen in particular in the context of TTIP. Strikes me as particularly surprising in a way. In the United States, I mean, let's face it, ISDS is in there because we wanted it in there, because we wanted to give our investors in foreign countries an option. It was a way, really, in a sense, of promoting foreign investment, because it gave US investors comfort that they had an alternative to local courts in a situation where they didn't trust the local courts. So that all of a sudden, from the United States perspective, we should be skeptical about the value of ISDS strikes me as kind of extraordinary. I understand why, in the transatlantic context, you might argue, nobody has any question about the integrity of Belgian courts. There's no reason why you shouldn't invest in Belgium with confidence that you can take a commercial dispute before a Belgian court and be confident in the result. The risk to me is, if the United States and the EU agree to a major trade agreement without ISDS in it, how do you ever think you're going to get China to agree to a trade agreement with ISDS in it? And how are you ever going to do a trade agreement without ISDS in it with China? So I think it's extraordinary and surprising that the United States in particular should be the ones trying to, that we should have a movement in the United States to take ISDS off the table. I think it's an own goal, to put it in European terms.
The great commentator, Michael Barone, political commentator in the United States, said all process arguments are insincere, including this one. And I suspect a lot of the arguments about process when it comes to investor disputes are insincere. Also, I would point out that the point about Belgian courts are probably pretty good, but the European Union includes a lot of other legal systems which may not be, or even in some industrialized democracies. The famous case of Raytheon v. Palermo in Italy is an interesting one to read, because it's why we decided espousal was never going to work and moved to treaty-based investment disputes. So there's an important history there that tends not to get brought in, but thank you for the question.
If I could,
yes.
But I understand where the question is coming from, given we just had our experience with CETA.
Yeah.
And given the local objections around ISDS. And I think that what our government has indicated is that perhaps some of the solutions that we found in resolving the issue that we had could be something that is ported into a modernized NAFTA. I would just say one little thing on Chapter 19, though, because I'll sneak it into my dispute settlement section. Canada's indicated that Chapter 19 is fundamental to the agreement, and it's something that we need to preserve. We're happy to modernize, but something we need to preserve. And one of the reasons is we're a little bit concerned, well, I'll say I'm a little bit concerned, that the administration has a greater agenda when it comes to anti-dumping and countervail. And that agenda will expand not only beyond NAFTA, but also to something like, the WTO. And so when my friends in the United States say, well, but you have the WTO has this process and you can follow this process, aside from the fact it's really expensive and really long and not particularly productive, I also worry that the next target on a Chapter 19 provision is the WTO.
Sure, fair point. Yes, other questions? Yes. Back here.
So I'm Michael Lauder with Volkswagen. Politically, Donald Trump needs a kind of victory, or at least for the sake of his pride in these negotiations. What kind of political victory in the negotiations do you think Canada and Mexico would find palatable?
Well, I guess you need to wait 4 more negotiating rounds to get that question answered. We're only on the second one now. So we started with the most sympathetic issues to deal with, and I think negotiations are moving forward on that path, and the tougher one's still to come. So I don't think there's an answer yet to that question.
Sergio makes a good point, which is in the third round of negotiations, which is upcoming, there's a promise for a consolidated text. And the consolidated text, if it emerges, will be a text that has either clear text or bracketed text, bracketed being the negotiator's tool for identifying what is not in agreement. And that, Sergio, the point he's made is we've identified a lot of the issues in common, but if we do get a consolidated text, that will probably be the clearest indication of what the scope of the negotiations would be, and from there you can sort of find where the solutions might be.
I think though that you can comment on principles
Yeah.
or qualities of an outcome without knowing the specifics. So balanced, modernized.
Yeah.
Lots of people use the do no harm message or the don't go back message. Those principles, trilateral, those principles are things that I think you can ascribe to an ideal outcome that would be something that Canada and Mexico would be supportive of.
I just wanted to observe, as the dust settled on our election last year and the administration took office and began to take these moves toward renegotiating NAFTA, in our working group process, I said, and then also in visits to Ottawa and Mexico City, I said to my friends, you guys need to start thinking about what you're going to give. What are you going to, Donald Trump needs something out of this process, and you guys need to be thinking about what you're going to give him that gets him out of this process. And you can imagine the reaction I got.
What will you give us?
Which was basically, I'm not thinking about that. But it's true, and I think they are thinking about it, in fact. And part of what motivated the recommendations that we made in June on the NAFTA renegotiation was an attempt to put some of those things on the table. I think it's too late for some of these things, but I think at the outset, a robust Mexican commitment to a minimum wage, to raising minimum wages would have been. Our friends from Mexican industry were horrified when we said that, of course, but let's face it, that's one of the mainsprings of this problem. The other thing was been mentioned here this morning, the enforcement piece. There's a lot of evasion of the rules of origin, not just in any one partner, but it's a difficult thing to enforce in the current environment. And so a robust arrangement among the customs authorities to work together more effectively and more forcefully to really seriously enforce the rule of origin and make sure that stuff that is purported to be of NAFTA origin is actually of NAFTA origin would be in the interest of all three parties. It would strengthen Mexican industry's global competitiveness, and it would do a lot to address the concerns that are underlying these things in NAFTA. So I think there are some things there that you could do and could be dressed up as wins for Mr. Trump. Our Mexican Canadian friends would probably have to bite their tongues and probably would injure themselves in the process, but it might be beneficial.
No, what I would add to that, Matt, is that obviously we are attentive of what is happening here. And if we talk about some principles, and we understand there are some wins needed here, but I would say there are also some wins needed in Canada and Mexico. And I will talk for the Mexican side. I mean, there is a presidential election next July. Mm-hmm. So I don't see the Mexican government coming out of this negotiation without a win, because that would have strong political costs for what will happen next summer. So, so we would need here a win-win-win process if we want to come out with a new NAFTA. Otherwise, I don't see how this is coming through.
We're all going to be really tired of winning by the time.
Yes, I think we've heard that promise. Thank you. This question here? Yes.
Hi, Chris Sands from Johns Hopkins CSIS. I have a question about following up on something Andrea raised, which is the engagement of the Business Council of Canada. The business community really was quiet about trade after the NAFTA fight was so divisive in the United States. Have the business communities in the process that George W. Bush Institute's launched, have you seen a sea change? Will business be more engaged on trade going forward? Is that possibly a legacy of this whole process, or is it too soon to tell?
I hope so. I mean, I think we're seeing it. I think we're seeing a little more engagement. We certainly encourage that through the working group process. I mean, I think at the outset of the administration and in the early moves, there was a calculation that there were other things on the table, and that there was perhaps, maybe he wasn't serious about trade. Maybe trade would be later on, and we could do other things first. That's proving not to be the case, and so I think as it reaches as the knife gets closer to the bone, the motivation increases. I don't know what your perception is.
It's imperative, I think, because I think that we're going to be right back here again if businesses don't emphasize to their politicians and their workers that trade is fundamental to their existence and their competitiveness. It's imperative, and so it's organizations like mine. It's our responsibility to make sure that we do everything that we can to facilitate our members who are located in more than 2/3 of the congressional districts in the United States, that they go out and meet with their member of Congress and make their local presence known.
What we should have learned in the last 23 years is the critics never stop.
No.
So if the proponents stop and the critics don't, you have an unbalanced conversation.
I must say that the Texas business community has been very vocal. And there's the Texas Association of Business, which has a presence in Washington and which has an agenda. I mean, they haven't been perhaps terribly public about it, but I think they've been pretty vocal behind the scenes. And Texas is probably one of the clear beneficiaries among the states of NAFTA and of trade in general. And I think the business community has been pretty clear about that.
The issue is sustaining it.
Yeah.
Because you have these blips. You do a trade agreement, you do NAFTA. In Canada, the business community was fundamental, and our organization, the Business Council of Canada, was fundamental in calling for NAFTA and supporting it. But you can't only have that activity when a negotiation is concluded and you celebrate. You have to continue that and sustain that work in between.
Yes, question here? Yes, sir.
Steve Landy, Manchester Trade. Just if we need another discussion on NAFTA, but I do appreciate the fact that we're getting views outside of Washington, which is nice for us who live in the bubble to hear people who actually think a little bit about issues. I think the key question, which just they asked, which is what can you give to Mr. Trump for his victory? And let me issue 5 ideas I have kicking around, and I'd be very interested in your own idea. One, I think Matthew already hit the point, wages. I mean, the fact of the matter is that Mexican wages have frozen. I don't know about productivity. I assume it went up. U.S. wages have not frozen and so on. I was listening to Obrador, the candidate for president. I swear he sounded like Mr. Trump. I mean, it could have been the same thing. All he talked about was raising wages. I kept saying, well, maybe that's Mr. Trump's solution, but I hope not. I don't want to go that way. Second issue, of course, is this problem of the value-added tax. It's not a question of whether Mexico has a value-added tax they can exempt, and we can. The issue is that soon after NAFTA went in effect, you guys kind of quadrupled your value-added tax, and then you, of course, rebated that on exports, so that became an export. The third possibility you don't hear much discussion about, which I never quite understand, is why don't you create a NAFTA product? And so on. There are products which are made in both countries with export competitiveness. You have a Secretary Ross who's very active in commerce. Why don't you begin to work on promoting the idea of NAFTA exports, and where they're headed? Fourth, do a study on origin rules. Not the U.S.-Mexican origin rules, but did you think of doing a study of the origin rules, for example, in the Mexican agreements? Because Mexico, as you know, has about twice as many free trade partners as the U.S. has. And of course, the components can come from the U.S., depending on the specific the specific mechanisms of the rules. So first you have to look at it and say, hey, can we do more joint products and perhaps move in that direction? And the fifth is an idea that a fairly important person mentioned, Chairman Brady of the Ways and Means Committee, when he says, hey, let's be clear. This is the first round of the negotiations. We're going to have a review of NAFTA in 5 years. President Trump thinks he'll still be in office in 5 years. We'll see, and so on. So why don't we make as much progress as we can in the next 8 months, 7 months, with the limits, as Sergio explained very clearly, and then really see how they work and come out. And of course, the final thing, which is what I really expected to hear from the people from the companies, is how do you get NAFTA investment? When President Trump was elected, he brought the states into play, he brought the tax code into play, and he claimed to have gotten 3 investments in terms of Ford and carrier staying. How do you get NAFTA investments? Thank you.
Anyone want to take any part of that?
Well, some were related to Mexico. You see, Matt, I should have brought my PowerPoint. All of that was So, wages. Let me say only a couple of things on that. It's not like you can write into an agreement, create chapter 25 of the NAFTA, paragraph 1, wages will be X number. Right. Doesn't work that way. It's the market that moves that, and it's productivity that increases wages. The only thing I would say there is that probably, and there's hard evidence on this, the most robust ally for increasing wages in Mexico is the opening of the economy, and was NAFTA.
Yeah.
Wages in exporting manufactured industries are between 30 and 50% higher than in the manufactured industry that is not exporting. So the strongest ally we have to increase wages is NAFTA. You mentioned also the VAT, and it was funny because I think it was the first or the second presidential debate during the elections. The VAT was like the top, the first issue that came out. And I think there's a huge misunderstanding on how the VAT works. So the VAT in Mexico is a consumption tax, and is applied to everybody in Mexico. Everybody means imports and local goods. So whenever a good enters into Mexico, it will pay a VAT because it enters in the border. But Mexican manufacturers will pay also a VAT. So there's no discrimination whatsoever to anybody when applying the VAT. It's like in the US, but in the US you have these consumption taxes by state.
Sales
so
tax, yes.
When we send our products to one of your states that has this consumption tax, we pay that tax, such as the local manufacturer. So what is very important to keep very clear on the VAT issue is that there is no discrimination to anybody. Mm-hmm. Everybody pays that, local and foreign, FTA or non-FTA. It's a consumption tax. And well, I guess I leave the others to the rest of the
just let me make a final comment on investment. Yes, it is true that the sluggish economy can be attributed to low rates of investment in the United States. Poor investment has led to poor productivity growth, which has contributed to slow economic growth. But as a trade guy, let me tell you, the best elixir for investment is tax reform, not trade policy. So I wish them well on tax reform, because I think that will free up capital and will raise productivity and cause higher rates of economic growth as the best next step. So with that, let me note that it's our time, and even if we start late, I try to adjourn on time. Well, I thank you for your time today and your attention to this important panel, and please join me in thanking them for their contributions.
Thank you, Scott. Well done.